So today we'll be talking about identifying injustices. This is the first section in our problem definition stage, which I'm really excited to move into because it's the start of the design process. So the process of problem solving around these topics that we've learned about. And the first things in our class have been really important to learn because now you can understand what a system is and the varying levels that it needs to be addressed, and you understand yourself and your position to these issues. So now you'll be ready to do this process in the most equitable format as we work towards collective liberation. The readings for this section are here, and they'll also be linked in the blog as always. I hope you enjoy them. We're just continuing to dive into these toolkits, as well as bringing in some outside readings from other groups that are really diving deep into this topic of equity. So a brief review from last time. Remember, again, that uplifting communities is vital for equitable liberation. This is the theme kind of this course, is without others, without collective movement forward, we will never reach the peak. We will never get forward in terms of making a collective society that values all. So the more we can build capacity and strength and upliftment, we can make a meaningful difference. The collective is critical for any work. We as individuals, we fight together, not alone. When we have movements, we hear more people. We see them and their capacity to change the system rather than relying on experts to determine what we can and cannot do. And it can very much at its peak be direct democracy in action and can honestly better define problems than traditional processes that often require designers with maybe a more elite perspective to come in and determine problem spaces. Liberatory mindsets for engaging with communities, which will again be reflected in this lecture as we start to go into what an injustice is and how do we work on one. It's just always, at the end of the day, challenge yourself and continue to be an open and active listener. Without these tactics, we will not be able to engage critically with the people that we do care about and we want to serve, we want to uplift, but our own biases will hold us back from doing so. And just remember that space and dialogue are critical towards belonging and feeling like you can be included in the process. And making sure that all throughout you are building trust, you're building agency, you're building capacity, because you might not always be in that space with those people. And so the more that you can set up communities, set up things that are sustainable beyond your involvement, the powerful your work can be. And I think this quote from the Racism and Inequity Are by Design article is really powerful for our transition into problem definition, is that we need to think that most problem definitions are created by biased individuals. And if we do not question our biases, we will be perpetuating inequity and not creating systems that actively acknowledge bias. So what is an injustice? I think many of us came in knowing, there's white supremacy, there's racism, there's sexism, homophobia, there's environmental degradation issues. These are all injustices. But I think it's sometimes hard to notice some of the more nuanced injustices and how they pop up beyond the big isms that we sort of see in our world. And I think when we think about any injustice, we have to think about these four concepts. An injustice is intentional. It has been created. Someone is acting upon it. Someone is creating it in order to lead to that deleterious impact. It is more often than not now covert than overt. We used to be like, well, I can see it, so it has to be a problem. Or we think we're not racist anymore, we're not homophobic anymore because we're not outwardly showing these biases. But the thing is, as it becomes more covert, we start to think of our blindnesses to all these issues that people are facing. And these injustices become even harder to address because they've gone under the surface. They're harmful. Injustices are long-term, will harm individuals. They will reduce life expectancy, well-being, It's a public health crisis in many ways to be facing systemic injustices. And more often than not, they are long-standing. Many times we might think of an issue, but it might be very quick and it leaves. But injustices, they continue. And they're nefarious in that they're honestly always there and sort of existing under the surface of some of our good intentions. And they are products of discrimination, which is a designed system. It's a tactic of underinvestment and ignorance of particular populations, and often can be seen when we look at history. Injustices don't just pop up and leave. They are results of others using power in order to oppress. And again, ignoring injustices will lead to long-term oppression. There is a reason why many marginalized people struggle in this country and other countries as well, because they have been put into a place of being oppressed. And it's very hard to get out of that place when the injustices pile up on you. And they differ from maybe short-term inconveniences. So a lot of product development kind of focuses on, this is what all people are feeling, this discomfort. But that can be different because they're usually a short-term irritant. They're not something that you're constantly facing, constantly battling against, and often are randomly applied. Injustices, I think we need to know, are intentionally applied to certain groups, and that makes them far different than just short-term, botherings that we sort of have. And so we're working in a space where we're trying to solve problems where there's not one solution, which is something we've continuously failed at, is that we think that we can address injustice by one avenue. Like if we feed all the poor people in the world, we will solve all these problems. We will just feed them and it will solve it. But as we saw with the birdcage metaphor, hunger and food is just one aspect of a cage of systems that oppress those that are marginalized. And most of the time, as much as we love data, sometimes we're just working with something that is very nebulous and it's hard to understand. And sometimes the problems don't just have one neat definition. And so maybe now you're feeling, well, how do I even move forward? How can I notice an injustice when they are so nebulous and covert? Here's some tactics that hopefully will help you as you're doing this process in your own spaces. And definitely feel free to discuss offline, either via email or if you're in the Slack community over there with your peers. But some tactics are often to start with connecting with people. We can read all we want about injustices, at least to set us up and prepare for having the language for the conversation. But often your best partners for defining an approach are going to be the people facing the injustice, because they've lived that experience far longer than we've maybe read about it or heard about it or watched it on a TV. You will often need to enter into the space without an imagined intervention. So often than not, design processes will have you come in with a design question that you want to solve. And while that has good intentions, it will often have negative impact because that can shape the way that you're approaching the design process. So you have to come in basically like, I'm ready to form the questions with you that we can come and investigate together. Always look for context, look for the current situation, look for the feelings, look for the things that people are facing, barriers that they're working up against. Ask even what people identify as their needs. Sometimes design processes will have us project needs, which is the last point, but more often than not, people can tell us what they want, or they can tell us hints of what would help. And then it takes our approach to kind of then synthesize and break down with those people to be like, is this what I heard? Is this what I understand? And helps us to start to move towards an actual intervention that's built from an understanding that others have given us. And I'll take the framework from racism and inequity are by design to kind of help us to then shape these learnings into an approach that helps us to move in a direction of, intervention that can be successful. We need to focus on the people. The person needs a way too. This is something that someone else needs. What do they have identified? Like, I need to have a job because people in my community don't get jobs. This is something that I know will uplift me and will uplift those around me if we are able to get jobs, just for example. Because insert the values, beliefs, and morals. This is trying to base this in that person's understanding of their world, in their context, in their history. Because might often be, we need money to be coming into this community. Without the money that comes from having employment that is long-term and sustained, we will not be able to uplift those around us. We'll not be able to educate send our children to good schools, give them the resources they need. We'll not be able to improve ourselves without having the financials that come from a well-paying job. Surprisingly, state a fact that demonstrates the intent to meet that need. This could be an understanding, which we'll talk about in a bit, about what has been done before, or what is currently happening, and why does that not work in the way that we were thinking it was going to work. And say that where finally the but comes in. So surprisingly, it'd be like, surprisingly, like there are a lot of jobs out there. Like we have employment gaps across many sectors. Then we get to the but. What is that inhibitor or that societal obstruction, that system that stops someone from being able to pursue the things that they need and they want? And we see the but more often than not, they will not employ someone without a college degree. They have biases in their process that marginalize those that come from poorer backgrounds, or those that have Black sounding names or Hispanic sounding names or foreign sounding names in general. And more often than not, like have just limitations in general in the job process that make it so that someone who maybe was not traditionally employed is not able to access that job or access that opportunity. And as we break this down, we realize we're starting with the human, starting with what that person believes, especially basing in their relationships and those constructs, and then moving out and zooming out to see those structural barriers that are often upheld by those other things. And so this is just important to just think about and helps you to frame those learnings that you're gaining from others. And throughout it all, reflect on power. You need to be designing with, you need to be acknowledging your privilege, as we talked previously. You need to ensure that decision-making power is held across the project, which we'll talk about in a few lectures from now. We'll talk about power. We'll talk about coalition building that is equitable, and just, again, keeping it in mind as you frame your design challenges. And finally, who is involved? Do they reflect the community? Do they reflect the people that we should be, working with versus working for? So just make sure that power is always a consideration as you're working to notice injustices. The final section of today, we're going to talk about history and healing. So this is just, I think it will see a little bit of a divergence from the previous two topics, but I think it's important for this stage of the design process as we're defining problems, because history is such an ingrained thing for many of these communities that have only seen continuous failure to address their needs. So always ask, as you're working on these problem definitions, who owns the narrative? Who has written the things that I have read that when I come into the space or I come into a new world with different people, that I'm coming in with that story? That is something that we've known is shaped. It's shaped by our schools. It's shaped by the media. It's shaped by the articles published on mainstream sources of news. It's everywhere in terms of who has written what we know to be facts. And so you are working with others and you are trying to ask meaningful questions to ensure that you're on a path of unlearning and decolonizing the way that you've seen the world. Seeking out alternative perspectives should not be a bad thing. It should be something that you are intentionally doing, because you might realize that those perspectives are entirely different from your own. And we'll talk a bit more about how to work with someone that maybe you disagree with parts of their perspective, but how to acknowledge that respectfully, because these are part of their histories. There are many, many ways in which we all have experienced the world, and we have all seen the world develop. And when we're only shaping it from those that who are the quote unquote winners, we're never going to see the perspectives of people that have not been able to see their stories told properly. So an action that you can take in this perspective, especially if you're on a problem definition scope, is try to find people that are your elders. Try to find those people that have been in the community that you're wanting to work with for a long time, and try to get to understand what has changed over time. How has this world that you've lived in shifted and changed over the years that you've been alive? And it can start to get us on a path of seeing the world differently and starting to see it through the eyes of people that we're wanting to work with. And untangling histories, the Equity-Centered Design Framework Handbook has great activity. I pulled it out just because I wanted y'all to see this. It's just questions you can ask, especially when you're maybe working with a community leader or working with an elder or working with a young person, on how people have been impacted by different historical events and starting to see what people have been dealing with so that we can work in a process that understands that and works towards healing and justice and liberation. Just make sure that these questions are just on your mind about what are people thinking? How were they affected? How were others affected in their opinions? And who was part of that process of designing that historical event? Who controlled the way that people experienced that event? And this can help us to start to think, here's how this oppression has lived in this space, so that we can start to go forward equitably, understanding that that is what people are bringing to the table when we talk about these problems. And this brings us to the equity pause, which I think is a really powerful technique for any part of your career, not just if you're doing problem solving or community organizing work or design work, but always having that time where you're checking in on what your current work looks like. With any team, we often don't stop to think about what we've learned. We don't stop to think about our biases. We don't stop to think about the barriers that might be. We often barrel forward once we have that beautiful problem statement or beautiful thing we want to work on, without often taking those stops to be like, are we actually going back and working on those goals that we set at the start, or those practices that we set at the start? And more often than not, that can be deleterious, again, to those people that we really want to help, we really want to work with, we really want to design powerful interventions for, that we're not stopping to think, are we actually doing what we said we were going to do from the outset? So some questions to ask, some more frameworks, which I love. And this is based, this first slide, there's two, but the first slide is based on these four things: your awareness, your inclusion, your relationships, and your acknowledgements. Your awareness, what have we not heard yet, or what has not been said, people have been afraid to say? Is there a topic that we haven't touched because we've been afraid to touch it because we don't know what we're going to hear? Specifically, if you're coming in as a person not from that community with a perspective on what they need, how is maybe that stops people from wanting to say, negative things about these types of interventions? And how do we make space if people feel comfortable to challenge the process? Make sure that you're hearing from everyone and that we are building relationships versus building extractive hierarchical dominance. Because listening and relationships are important to making sure that people have long-term buy-in to whatever you're working on, which is often not a product of many interventions. And again, as we kind of gave you a tactic to acknowledge history, you can also think about, history can be toxic, it can be something that's painful, but there can also be beautiful histories and beautiful ways in which people have supported one another, which is a tactic we talked about previously, about uplifting those assets of a community versus always focusing on deficits. And finally, question your processes, those goals that you had, and always your biases. Always think, are we going on the right track? If we're defining a problem this way, are we checking in to make sure that this is really what people have said or people have told us? And goals-wise, is this a process that is bringing us more towards equity and inclusion? And can we check in with people to make sure we're doing that? Because we always need to be challenging the blind spots that we have, because they're very powerful in terms of the ways we see the world and move forward. So some closing thoughts. This was a beautiful lecture to get us in the mindset of design, get us in the mindset of starting to build powerful problem statements, which we'll cover more next time in terms of learnings and understandings from communities. But this at least should give you a good setup for where to start as you're informing your practices. So I would like, again, this is the quote, we have to always understand that we are a country that's founded on the genocide of the native populations and the enslavement of Black populations. Without knowing that that is part of the basis of America, we are hardly able to question and get to the point of understanding how many of these injustices came to be. And as always, communities should determine the problems we design interventions for. Without noticing what's going on and allowing people to tell their stories, we are hardly going to work on the injustices that really need to be addressed in our society. So your next readings, again, I kind of hinted at this, but we're going to be talking about how to do effective engagement and learning strategies. And we'll be talking about how design cannot just be done by white men, but has to be done by people that are closest to the problems. So thank you. I hope you had a great time with this lecture. And I'm excited to see y'all all not next week, Friday. So bye.